It's week 16 of the NFL season, and here are my predictions for this week. But first, how did I do last week in my predictions? In week 15, I went 11-5 in my predictions. And before getting into the video, I want to say thank you so much for 800 subscribers. So kicking off the week on Thursday Night Football, we have the 9-5 Broncos versus the 8-6 Chargers. The Broncos are coming off a 31-13 win against the Colts. In that game, Bo Nix went 20 of 33, 130 yards, 3 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. He was also their leading rusher with 23 rushing yards, and Courtland Sutton led them with 3 receptions, 32 yards and a touchdown. Then for the Chargers, they're coming off a 40-17 loss against the Buccaneers. In that game, Justin Herbert went 21 of 33, 195 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception, and Ladd McConkey led them with 5 receptions, 58 yards, and a touchdown. But coming into this week, Justin Herbert is questionable with an ankle injury, and the Chargers have now lost 3 out of their last 4 games, and the Broncos have now won 4 in a row. But these teams are tied for the least amount of points given up per game, at just 16 points per game, so this should be a pretty low-scoring game. And I think the Broncos are going to win. Then moving over to Saturday, the 9-5 Texans versus the 13-1 Chiefs. The Texans are coming off a 20-12 win against the Dolphins. CJ Stroud went 18 of 26 with 131 yards and 2 touchdowns. As a team, they combined for 77 yards rushing, and their leading receiver was Joe Mixon with 5 receptions for 33 yards. But Nico Collins also had 2 receiving touchdowns. And their defense in this game played amazingly, having 3 sacks and 3 interceptions, and 2 of those were by Derek Stingley Jr. Then for the Chiefs, they're coming off a 21-7 win against the Browns. Patrick Mahomes went 19 of 38, 159 yards and 2 touchdowns, but he did get injured in this game and is questionable for this week with a high ankle sprain. But in that game, the Chiefs defense played great with 5 sacks, 4 interceptions, and a total of 6 turnovers. But even if Patrick Mahomes doesn't play, this Chiefs team has a very good defense, and I think Carson Wentz could play good enough to get the win, so I have the Chiefs winning. Then the 10-4 Steelers versus the 9-5 Ravens. The Steelers are coming off a 27-13 loss against the Eagles. In that game, Russell Wilson went 14 of 22 with 128 yards and a touchdown. As a team, they only had 56 yards rushing, and their leading receiver was Calvin Austin with 5 receptions for 65 yards. Then for the Ravens, they're coming off a 35-14 win against the Giants. And in that game, Lamar Jackson went 21 of 25, 290 yards and 5 touchdowns, while also having 6 carries for 65 yards. And Rashad Bateman had 3 receptions, 80 yards and 2 touchdowns. So coming into this week, George Pickens is still questionable, and he has missed each of the last 2 games. And now TJ Watt is also questionable. But the Steelers have won 8 out of their last 9 games against the Ravens. So I have the Steelers winning. Then moving over to Sunday, the 3-11 Browns versus the 6-8 Bengals. In the Browns' loss against the Chiefs, Jameis Winston went 16 of 25 with 146 yards and 3 interceptions. Jerome Ford had 84 yards rushing and a touchdown, and that touchdown was for 62 yards. And Jerry Jeudy had a big game with 11 receptions and 108 yards. And with that game, Jerry Jeudy has his first career 1,000-yard season, and is currently sitting 5th in the NFL in receiving yards, with 1,052, and still has 3 games to go. So he could definitely have around 1,200 to 1,300 yards. But also in that game, Nick Chubb broke his foot and is out for the rest of the season. Then for the Bengals, they're coming off a 37-27 win against the Titans. Joe Burrow went 26 of 37, 271 yards, 3 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Then Chase Brown had a really big game with 97 yards rushing and a touchdown and a receiving touchdown. And Jamar Chase had 9 receptions for 94 yards and now has over 1,400 yards receiving on the season. I think this is going to be a very close game. The Browns are going to try to spoil the Bengals' playoff chances. But with how many interceptions Jameis Winston's been thrown lately, I think the Bengals are going to win. Then the 8-6 Rams versus the 4-10 Jets. The Rams are coming off a 12-6 win against the 49ers on Thursday Night Football. ball. In that game, Kyren Williams had 29 carries for 108 yards, and Puka Nacua had 7 receptions for 97 yards. And the Rams have now won 7 out of their last 9. Then for the Jets, they're coming off a 32-25 win against the Jaguars, and that broke their 4-game losing streak. And Aaron Rodgers played very good, with 289 yards and 3 touchdowns, and led the team with 45 yards rushing. Then Davante Adams had 9 receptions for 198 yards and 2 touchdowns. But this Rams team is red hot, and they're still in good position to make the playoffs, so I have the Rams winning. Then the 12-2 Eagles versus the 9-5 Commanders. In the Eagles win against the Steelers, Jalen Hurts went 25-32 with 290 yards and 2 touchdowns, and also had 45 yards rushing and a rushing touchdown. Then Saquon Barkley was held to just 65 yards rushing, and is no longer on pace to break the single-season rushing record, but is still on pace for a 2,000-yard season. Then A.J. Brown had 110 yards receiving and a touchdown, and Devontae Smith had 109 yards receiving and a touchdown. Then for the Commanders, they're coming off a 20-19 win against the Saints, and during the fourth quarter, the Commanders were up 20-7, and the Saints would make a comeback, and they even scored a 1-yard touchdown with zeros on the clock, but they ended up going for a 2-point conversion and didn't get it, so they lost by 1. In this game, Jaden Daniels went 25-31, 226 yards and 2 touchdowns, and also led the team in rushing yards with 66, and Terry McLaurin had 7 receptions, 73 yards and 2 touchdowns, and he's now second in the NFL in receiving touchdowns with 11. But entering this week, the Eagles have won 6 out of their last 7 games against the Commanders, so I have the Eagles winning. Then the 2-12 Giants versus the 7-7 Falcons. In the Giants' loss against the Ravens, Tommy DeVito exited the game with a concussion, and Tim Boyle played the rest of the game and went 12-24 with 123 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Devin Singletary had a rushing touchdown, and Malik Neighbors had 10 receptions for 82 yards and a touchdown. Then for the Falcons, they're coming off a 15-9 win against the Raiders on Monday Night Football. Kirk Cousins went 11-17, 112 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Then Bijan Robinson had 125 yards rushing, and Drake London had 3 receptions, 53 yards, and a touchdown. And on defense, they had 4 sacks and 2 interceptions, and held the Raiders to just 249 yards. Then the Giants are giving up the second most rushing yards per game, at 143 yards per game. So Bijan Robinson should have another great game, and I had the Falcons winning. Then the 7-7 Cardinals versus the 3-11 Panthers. The Cardinals are coming off a 30-17 win against the Patriots. Kyler Murray went 23-30, 224 yards. Then James Conner had 110 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns, and Trey McBride had 9 receptions for 87 yards. Then for the Panthers, they're coming off a 30-14 loss against the Cowboys. Bryce Young went 19-28, 219 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions. Chuba Hubbard was held to just 32 yards rushing, and Jalen Coker had 4 receptions, 110 yards, and a touchdown. And that touchdown was 83 yards. So entering this game, Xavier Legette is ruled doubtful with a groin injury, and the Panthers are allowing the most rushing yards per game at 173. So Kyler Murray and James Conner should have a big day running the ball, and I have the Cardinals winning. Then the 3-11 Titans versus the 6-8 Colts. In the Titans' loss against the Bengals, Will Levis started off this game 8 of 12 with 89 yards and 3 interceptions. Then Mason Rudolph came in and went 21 of 26 with 209 yards, 2 touchdowns, and an interception. Tony Pollard had 45 yards rushing and a touchdown. And Tajay Spears had 6 receptions for 87 yards and a touchdown, and also had a rushing touchdown. Then in the Colts loss against the Broncos, Anthony Richardson had just a 44% completion percentage, going 17 of 38, 172 yards and 2 interceptions. Then Jonathan Taylor had 107 yards rushing, and Michael Pittman had 6 receptions for 58 yards. And the Colts are giving up the 3rd most amount of rushing yards per game at 141, so both of these teams should be able to run the ball pretty well in this game, so it's probably going to come down to who has the better quarterback play. And both of these teams have been struggling a lot at the quarterback position, but I still have the Colts winning. Then the 12-2 Lions versus the 4-10 Bears. The Lions are coming off a 48-42 loss against the Bills. During that game, Jared Goff went 38 of 59, 494 yards and 5 touchdowns. Jahmyr Gibbs had 31 yards rushing and a touchdown, and 83 yards receiving with a touchdown. Sam Laporta had 111 yards receiving, and Amon-Ra St. Brown had 14 receptions, 193 yards, and a touchdown. And they lost a lot more than just the game this week, with losing 4 major players on their team. David Montgomery is now out for the season with a knee injury. Khalil Dorsey is out for the season with an ankle injury. Aleem McNeil ruptured his ACL, and Carlton Davis fractured his jaw. But for the Bears, they're coming off a 30-12 loss against the Vikings on Monday Night Football. Caleb Williams in that game went 18 of 31 with 191 yards and a touchdown. DeAndre Swift had 79 yards rushing, and Keenan Allen had 82 yards receiving and a touchdown. But even with all the Lions' injuries, they still have an elite offense, so I still have the Lions winning. Then the 12-2 Vikings versus the 8-6 Seahawks. In that Vikings win against the Bears, Sam Darnold went 24 of 40, 231 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Aaron Jones had 86 yards rushing and a touchdown, and Justin Jefferson had 7 receptions, 73 yards, and a touchdown. Then for the Seahawks, they're coming off a 30-13 loss against the Packers. Geno Smith went 15 of 19, 149 yards, and an interception, and is questionable for this week with a right knee injury. Then Zach Charbonnet, in just 8 carries, had 54 yards and a touchdown, and Jackson Smith-Njigba had 10 receptions for 83 yards. But this season, the Seahawks are just 3-5 at home, and this Vikings team is one of the hottest teams in the NFL, so I had the Vikings winning. Then the 3-11 Patriots versus the 11-3 Bills. In the Patriots' loss against the Cardinals, Drake May went 19 of 23, 202 yards, a touchdown, and an interception. Ramondre Stevenson had 69 yards rushing, and Kendrick Bourne had 3 receptions for 44 yards. Then in the Bills' win against the Lions, Josh Allen had 362 yards and 2 touchdowns, while also having 68 yards rushing and 2 rushing touchdowns. Then James Cook also had 105 yards rushing and 2 rushing touchdowns. And Ty Johnson led them with 5 receptions for 114 yards. With the Bills coming off that massive win, I could see this being a trap game, but with the way the Bills have been playing, it's very hard to pick against them, so I still have the Bills winning. Then the 3-11 Jaguars versus the 2-12 Raiders. In the Jaguars' loss against the Jets, Mac Jones went 31 of 46, 294 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 2 interceptions. Travis Etienne had 65 yards rushing, and Brian Thomas Jr. had 10 receptions for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. Then in the Raiders' loss against the Falcons, Desmond Ridder had 208 yards, a touchdown, and 2 interceptions, and led the team with 28 yards rushing. Then Jacoby Myers had 5 receptions for 59 yards. These are 2 of the worst teams in the NFL, but one of them has to win, unless it's a tie, but I think the Jaguars will win. Then the 6-8 49ers versus the 6-8 Dolphins. In the 49ers' loss against the Rams, Brock Purdy had 142 yards and an interception. Isaac Garango had 57 yards rushing, and George Kittle had 4 receptions for 61 yards. Then for the Dolphins, in their loss against the Texans, Tua went 29 of 40, 196 yards, a touchdown, and 3 interceptions, and Malik Washington led them with 5 receptions for 52 yards. And for this week, Jalen Waddle is questionable. But the 49ers have also had a lot of injuries lately, but they did get an extra day of rest for playing last week on Thursday night. And I could definitely see this game going either way, but I still think the 49ers are going to win. Then the 8-6 Buccaneers versus the 6-8 Cowboys. In the Buccaneers' blowout win against the Chargers, Baker Mayfield went 22 of 27, 288 yards, 4 touchdowns, and an interception. Bucky Irving had 117 yards rushing, and Mike Evans had 9 receptions for 159 yards and 2 touchdowns. And he's now up to 749 yards on the season, so he still has a chance to keep his streak alive of 1,000-yard seasons. Then for the Cowboys, in their win against the Panthers, Cooper Rush had 214 yards and 3 touchdowns. Rico Dowdle had 149 yards rushing, and CeeDee Lamb had 9 receptions, 116 yards, and a touchdown. And on their defense, they had 6 sacks and 2 interceptions. But coming into this week, the Buccaneers have won 4 games in a row, but the Cowboys have also won 3 out of their last 4. But they're also allowing the 3rd most points per game at 27, and the Buccaneers are scoring the 4th most points per game at 28.8. And I think the Buccaneers are going to win. Then finally on Monday Night Football, the 5-9 Saints versus the 10-4 Packers. In the Saints' loss against the Commanders, Spencer Rattler went 10 of 21 with 135 yards and a touchdown, and Marquez Valdes-Scantling had 2 receptions for 64 yards. And on defense, they had 8 sacks. But also this week, Alvin Kamara is questionable, and Derek Carr is also questionable. Then for the Packers, in their win against the Seahawks, Jordan Love went 20 of 27 with 229 yards and 2 touchdowns. Josh Jacobs had 94 yards rushing and a touchdown, and Christian Watson had 3 receptions for 56 yards. Then their defense had 7 sacks and 2 interceptions. And they also held the Seahawks to just 208 yards as a team. So I have the Packers winning. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Goodbye.